All right, well, good morning, everybody from the ALEC headquarters in Arlington, Virginia. I'm Lee Schalk. Welcome to our preview call of the 15th edition of Rich States, Poor States. We'll go ahead and get started this morning. I'd like to introduce ALEC CEO Lisa B. Nelson to give opening remarks and to introduce our authors.
Well, thank you, Lee, and I couldn't be more proud of the launch that we're putting out today, our 15th edition of Rich States, Poor States, with some amazing partners in crime here at ALEC, with both Dr. Arthur Laffer from Laffer Associates and Steve Moore coming to us both from Nashville and from, I think, Washington, D.C. Steve, I'm assuming you're in D.C. this today. Along with Jonathan Williams, our esteemed chief economist and policy director here at ALEC. This publication has become such a hallmark of what ALEC stands for. And I think in the conversation before we were joined by all of you, we were talking about, being pro-growth and being nonpartisan, making sure that policy is what drives us and making sure that the policies that make states succeed are what ALEC puts forward. And I couldn't be more proud. I think there's going to be some new exciting developments in this, some big movers. It's like a golf Saturday moving day. There was a big move and a big shakeup by some of the states. And I know that our authors will be drilling down into those details as soon as we turn it back over. And I just couldn't be more happy to kick this call off. And I'm going to turn it back over to the experts. Thank you so much, Lee.
Thank you, Lisa. And of course, we are joined by our three esteemed authors of this report, Dr. Arthur Laffer, economist Stephen Moore, and our very own Jonathan Williams, chief economist and executive vice president of policy here at ALEC. To kick us off in our preview call, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Laffer on the importance of this report. Why are we releasing this? Why is it so important to study these economic variables and rank the 50 states? Dr. Laffer, over to you.
Yeah, well, if I can, it's just a fun way of looking at the world. If you believe incentives matter, state policymakers have the effect of changing those incentives in the state, both at a state level and local levels. And those changes in incentives have consequences. And I started this measure back in 1978. I don't know if any of you, no one else here was born then, but that was when Proposition 13 passed in California. And I'd written a bunch of stuff on why I thought this would be really good for California and what I thought would happen. And I stumbled on a couple of these measures there and have started then really doing this every year for all the states. From 78 on. And California, by the way, when we cut Prop 13, I think California's unemployment rate was 2.5% above the national average. It dropped right down to the national average. California over the next decade grew by San Francisco a year, by Massachusetts over the period. Property values were a little bit below the national average before Prop 13, then went up to way above it, and then we've been doing this, ranking it. And I used it for an investment fund for quite some time and then passed it, I think, over to ALEC. And 15 years ago, is it, Lisa? 15 years ago. I mean, amazing. Steve Moore, I had to get him out of the third grade to bring him on board with me in that. And but it's been wonderful from then on. And I think it has really, really worked well. Jonathan did a wonderful paper a few years back showing how the rankings really do predict the performance in the future. Now, there are exceptions, obviously, when you get Katrina and some of these other things that happen, they do. But this is a very, very solid menu for how to get your state to prosper. Now, there's some states like South Carolina that do well in spite of it. But, there are some states that do badly in without it. I mean, but this is a very tried and true formula, and ranking the states by this, I think, is a great way of picking out how to pick winners and how states should run their states, how government should run their states. Thanks.
Thanks, Dr. Laffer. And Steve, what say you about the importance of economic policies across the states in contrast to what we're seeing in Washington today? But talk to us a little bit about your involvement and the importance of the Rich States, Poor States publication each year.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for ALEC for doing this really important study that seems to have a really big impact on what state officials, governors, and state legislators are doing. And the world seems to be moving in our direction on the state level, where we're seeing really improvements in tax codes, improvements in fixing unfunded liabilities and pension systems, although there's a lot of work to be done there. Arthur, you worked, I know, with the governor of Colorado to get some transparency in healthcare, which could really drive down healthcare costs. School choice, I know that's not directly a part of this, but my gosh, we're making so much improvement on that area too. So ALEC has really led the charge in all of these things. And so I like the direction of I don't like the direction the federal government is going, but I sure like the direction of so many of these states. I'll make just a few points. One is we have done this for 15 years, and I believe every year of the 15, Utah has come out #1. So congratulations to Governor Cox there and the previous governors who've done an amazing job. And anyway, I just got back from Salt Lake City. It's booming. It's an incredibly vibrant place, and they've got the whole formula put together very well there. I always am so anxious when we put these numbers together to see who's going to finish worse, whether it's me, California, New York. And I forget, Jonathan, which won this year?
Unfortunately, it's back to New York again. Despite the best efforts of our friends there, like Robert Smullen in the Assembly, the big government voices have continued to win out in Albany, unfortunately.
Yeah. So, they've come a long way since 1978, Arthur, when you did Proposition 13 there. There's so much work to be done. We're working with some of the candidates who are running for governor in New York, and there's a lot of talk about moving towards a flat tax, using the rich states, poor states as a model for doing that. So these are all very positive developments. Congratulations, by the way, I saw North Carolina made a big move upward. I think when we started on this, Arthur, they were like 20 or something like that.
And they were really terrible, Steve, if you remember. And the thing I'd like to point out is it is bipartisan or nonpartisan, as Lisa says. And
they have a Democratic governor.
Is the Democrat.
Yeah, the governor is a Democrat there, and he's signed a lot of this legislation that the Republican, legislature passed. And then the previous governor was really quite good as well there. So they've really moved up. Indiana's really moved up considerably. Proud of those states. I'll make one other point and then turn it over to you, Jonathan. States, because of what's happened with COVID and the massive trillions of dollars the federal government has added to the states, which I think has been a huge mistake. By the way, the only way the federal government can you see me?
Yeah, we can see you.
Oh, all of a sudden I lost myself on the screen. Anyway, the states the federal government can only give money to states by taking money from states, right? So it's an illusion that somehow the federal government is bailing out the states. The federal government just takes a carrying cost and takes the money from the states and gives it back. But they've passed trillions of dollars onto the states. And these states have, for the most part, gigantic surpluses right now. And this is a great time to use those surplus revenues to fix their tax code. So this is a magic moment. It's a magic moment for school choice because parents want their kids in good schools. It's a magic moment for tax reform at the state level. And so I think even in some of these, blue states that have been traditionally very liberal, they're looking at some reforms that could really make their states more prosperous. So I think the direction is good. And I think a lot of that direction is a result of the rich state, poor states ranking. And just to set the record straight, I was in 5th grade when Arthur Laffer started this study.
Well, thank you, Steve. And Jonathan, I'd like to go to you next. First of all, walk us through what exactly rich states, poor states is measuring, why these variables are important. And then if you would, break some news for our viewers today. I think we may have heard some hints on who took the top spot and the bottom spot, but talk to us also about the rankings this year and what people can expect.
Well, thanks, Lee. And it's just such a pleasure. I can't believe it's been 15 years, but having the pleasure to work with Stephen and Dr. Laffer for this period of time. It was my first week at ALEC that we came with this idea you brought to us and said, boy, wouldn't it be great if ALEC could help get this out and we could continue to take this to state legislators, and the kind of results that we've seen over these years. Of course, some of the states like Utah have stayed at #1 for all 15 editions. So congratulations to our friends out in Salt Lake, and Senate President Stuart Adams, I know, has a grin this wide right now as staying at #1, something that they have doubled down on their success. They always are looking in the rearview mirror to see who's trying to catch them. And I think there's lots of great stories that we could unpack about Utah, but they never rest on their laurels. And that's one of, I think, the important pieces that we've learned over the years is you can fall behind simply by standing still in the rankings. And as other states become that much more competitive, you talked about a couple a minute ago, Steve, with North Carolina, moving from number 26 a decade ago to now #2, its best ranking of all time. Started with then Speaker of the House, Tom Tillis, now U.S. Senator Tom Tillis, was on the ALEC board of directors. He began this process of tax reform, which then, of course, culminated with Governor Cooper signing the bill that got to his desk after our great ALEC members in the legislature led the way on this to became a flat tax a few years ago, reduce that flat tax rate now to below 4%. And this is huge, folks, they actually now are going to phase out their business income tax altogether by the end of the decade. They're at 2.5% right now in North Carolina, and they're going to 0. So we've got an elimination of a major tax, and that couldn't have been done without all the hard work over this last decade. But North Carolina is such a shining success story.
Jonathan, you got to give credit to someone to McCrory too as well. I mean,
absolutely.
That one, I mean, especially the unemployment reform was just amazing. Sorry.
No, you're right. I mean, Governor McCrory did great work, and North Carolina continues to be a shining example of free market reforms. And to the point that Steve made, I think just from a broader landscape analysis of what's going on right now, something that we've been just so pleased to see is the governors and legislators leading the way in cutting taxes this year. I mean, folks, if we can't cut taxes in a year like this when there's so much money sloshing around in state budgets, we might as well give up the ghost and not even attempt it. This is the year to cut taxes. We saw Governor Kim Reynolds, an ALEC alumnus from Iowa, and our great ALEC members like John Wills get their flat tax done. And she was able to give the response to President's State of the Union a number of weeks ago with the great compare and contrast of what the free market success stories look like in the states versus the big government socialism approach going on in Washington, D.C. right now. Couldn't have been a better contrast for how our ideas are winning. And then just in the last several weeks after that, we saw our friends in Georgia. We saw Speaker Philip Gunn and the friends in Mississippi both create flat taxes. We saw the court in Arizona rule in the direction of where we wanted to go with lower tax rates and down to a flat tax because of the great work of the legislature last year. And so in the grand totality, and Arthur, you'll have to correct me if I get this slightly wrong, but state income taxes started about 110 years ago with Wisconsin and the progressive movement. In my estimation, there's been about 4 states that went from progressive income taxes down to a flat tax in that 110-year period before about a month ago. And in the last 4 or 5 weeks, we've seen 4 more states become flat tax states and go away from progressive income taxes. So think about that progress of what's gone on right now. And it wouldn't have happened without all of the great work, Steve, and you and Dr. Laffer, and the research that's out there, moreover, to show what works and what doesn't work. This isn't, Arthur, as you point out all the time, this is basic economics 101. And this is clearly what the founders had in mind from the laboratories of democracy, of taking the stories of what works, comparing them against the stories of what does not work. And sure enough, the rising tide is lifting all boats when it comes to good policy right now. And so walking through the top 10 briefly, and this is just some great success stories here. We talked about Utah at #1. We talked about North Carolina at #2. Arizona, because of that great reform in recent session last year, and now the court ruling, Arizona's moved up from 13 to 3, one of the biggest winners this year in their best all-time ranking. Oklahoma coming in at 4, Idaho 5, Nevada 6, Indiana 7, Florida 8, North Dakota 9, and Wyoming 10. So that is our top 10 this year for economic outlook. Of course, that's based on our 15 equally weighted factors of taxes and labor policy and regulation. And as Arthur developed these, I mean, I think the point that is so important is we've looked at it, we've studied it at ALEC to show there's a huge, meaningful correlation here that's robust between these rankings and future economic performance, whether it's migration, whether it's income growth, whether it's GDP growth, the things that matter for real well-being and the performance of a state. This really has a good deal of predictive value in going forward with those. Now, taking a look at the bottom and the stories that we need to learn the lessons from in terms of what not to do in many cases. Unfortunately, Steve, to answer your question there, New York, 50th out of 50. Once again, unfortunately, and given what I've just seen from Governor Hochul, she seems to be doubling down on the bad ideas of the past and maybe even going further to the left than Andrew Cuomo was, if that's even possible. New Jersey has fallen several spots this year, partly due to their recent millionaires tax increase that Governor Phil Murphy put through right in the middle of the pandemic, unfortunately, on so many of those small businesses and pass-through entities paying on the individual side of the code. California at 48, Vermont, Minnesota, Illinois, Maine, Hawaii, Maryland, and Oregon round out the bottom 10. And so I wanted to pause there. We put the top 10, bottom 10 in the chat box there. You can go through that. And I wanted to get reaction from Arthur, you or Steve on top and bottom 10. And then there's a few of the top winners and top losers of the gainers and whatnot that we should probably unpack in a little bit more detail as well.
Let me just reinforce what you said, Jonathan, on the, a flat tax is almost equally as important as the highest marginal tax rate. Progressivity is an enormous killer of prosperity in state and local taxes. It's just really important to have a flat tax.
I would just add one thing to what Arthur said, because this is really important. And Arthur and I and Larry Kudlow worked on the Trump tax bill of 2017, which thankfully has not been repealed. And one of the important features of that bill was the elimination of the state and local tax deduction. And the Democrats in Congress made a go at it to try to bring back the state and local tax deduction, but they failed. And so that makes it, in my opinion, just economically untenable for these states like New York and California and Illinois and New Jersey and others to maintain these tax rates of 10, 11, 12, 13%. It used to be that the wealthy in those states could write off 40% of those taxes, of their federal taxes. So it actually brought the effective rate down to, in some cases, 8% from, say, 13. That's no longer the case. And I think it just makes the tax cutting imperative all the more important. These states across the country really are bringing down rates. We continue to see, who's going to win the race to be the 10th state with no income tax. There are 9 right now. And so, but there's a lot of activity, as Jonathan knows, because you've been hopping from one state to another, where in states like Mississippi and states like Oklahoma and states like Louisiana, West Virginia, Nebraska, there is a lot of discussion about eliminating the income tax in those states. And Arthur, you always say, it would be one thing if there were no states that didn't have an income tax, but we do have 9 prosperous states that are able to pay their bills and provide good schools and roads without having an income tax. So it can be done, it should be done. And that's our next big quest, is try to see who's going to be next in terms of eliminating the state income tax entirely.
Jonathan, you had mentioned the states that have moved.
Dr. Laffer might be muted there. I think he was trying to.
I was Steve. Yeah, Steve, tell him what happened to the unearned income tax that was put through in Washington. I think it was thrown out, wasn't it?
I think so. Jonathan, do you know what happened with that?
Yes. We live to fight another day in Washington State.
Yeah, I mean, that's just an amazing victory, Jonathan. Congratulations on that.
And Arthur, on top of that, I think it was this year, Jonathan, you follow these things more closely than I do, but I believe in New Hampshire, they got rid of their capital gains tax. Is that right?
Yes, they followed Tennessee's lead, and the great work that you were doing there, Arthur. And so Tennessee went first and completely eliminated the whole income tax, which we've been talking about for many years, to remove the asterisks from having no income tax. And so Tennessee is fully no income tax state. There's a great story here because ALEC members then came to us and talked about, well, we would love to do that. We've got surplus revenue. And so we were able to use the Tennessee example directly to this point of states learning from each other in laboratories of democracy, and brought on legislators from Tennessee and brought your work, Dr. Laffer and Steve, to the legislators of New Hampshire. And sure enough, last year they passed the phase out. Ken Weiler, our great ALEC chair of tax and fiscal for many years, got that done as finance chair. Governor Sununu signed it into law. And so they are in a 5-year phase out, I believe, and to remove the asterisks from the income tax there in New Hampshire as well. So live free or die, they're doubling down.
Well, it was put on in Washington, but we got that removed too. I don't think there's any zero income tax state now that we have to qualify by saying it's only on earned income.
That's right.
All the 9 states are income tax free, earned and unearned.
And I think a great point of what you both made there on the flat tax is, I know the goal from, let's say, Speaker Gunn in Mississippi, and I'm talking to our great friends in Iowa, and I see our friend, former Speaker Linda Uppmeyer with us. Hi, Linda. You began this great work for tax reform in Iowa that they've built upon, but I would take a look at those 2 states in particular now with getting a flat rate. Boy, it's going to be that much easier to get rid of that income tax over time with this surplus growth. And as we're going to see, in-migration continue to grow, and the great virtuous cycle of becoming more competitive, seeing more in-migration, more job creation, and really realizing the benefits of the Laffer curve, they're going to have the ability to continue to cut those rates. Let me go through a couple.
One thing I was just going to add that this is a very similar situation in Arizona, where Arizona now effectively has a 2.5% flat tax, which is one of the maybe the lowest in the country, other than the states that have no income tax at all. And so we're Arthur and I are, and I think you're involved in this too. We're working with some of these gubernatorial candidates because there's a big governor's race there in Arizona, but they could easily ratchet it down to 0, and that would be. And Arizona already ranks what, 3rd or 4th or 5th on our rankings, so they could maybe be taking Utah on for number 1.
That's right. That's right. Well, let me give you 2 more quick stories and we'll get to questions. I know Lee's got a few for us already coming in, and folks in the chat box as well. But now that we have this 15-year track record and we have a consistent time series to be able to track progress or lack of progress, there's a few improvement stories I think that are notable that we should highlight. And there's a few, let's call them stories of decay, as Nick Stark came up with on our team. It's a good way of putting it. Some of the big improvers now over 15 years, we've seen my home state of Michigan become 17th best this year after being as bad as, in the bottom 15 for many of the years under Governor Granholm because of right to work and tax cuts and reducing the business income tax, doing pension reform. Michigan's really turned the corner. Montana, and this is something I know we've all worked, we love Governor Gianforte. He's going to be, I think, a great free market governor there in Montana. They're already turning the corner and have improved into 31st place from 43rd after big income tax cuts. New Hampshire, as we've talked about what they did, and Wisconsin, let's not forget, we're going on, 10 plus years of Act 10 and Scott Walker's great reforms in Wisconsin, and they're showing huge dividends. Wisconsin was once ranked 33rd in rich states, poor states. Wisconsin is now 14th today. Of course, North Carolina, Indiana, so many of the others that continue to move up over time are really important to highlight. And then just finally, the stories of decay. Let me just say 2, I think that really do stick out. One is I'm a resident of, I'm a taxpayer of the Commonwealth of Virginia here. And it wasn't many years ago, it was about 10 years ago, I guess, that Speaker Bill Howell, who was then ALEC on the ALEC Board of Directors, had us in Richmond to launch the edition of Rich States, Poor States that year. And Virginia ranked number 3. Fast forward to today, when Virginia is all the way down to number 24. The biggest loser of the 15 years of our report is Virginia. And this is something I know that we've all, Steve, you had talked to Governor Youngkin as he was going around the state running for election to say, we've got to reverse the trends here in Virginia. And he was carrying rich states, poor states with him. Virginia's got a lot to recover from some bad years of policymaking, certainly in Richmond. And then contrast that with North Carolina, that at the same time as Virginia was going from 3 to 24, North Carolina was going from 26 to 2. And it happens to be on the southern border, of course, of Virginia as one of their major competitors. So a really interesting takeaway there, unfortunately, for Virginia. And Maryland, once ranked 20th best, now 42nd. So both in the DC area here. Maybe it's part of the drinking water around the Beltway, gentlemen, but there's something going on in Virginia and Maryland that needs to be reversed. So any comments on some of those stories, and then we'll get to questions. Lee, I think we're ready for questions.
All right. Well, we had one question from our friend, Robert Smullen, state representative from New York. His question pertains to the latest budget. We've seen all the headlines with Governor Hochul, but New York's got a $220 billion deficit increasing measure. And he's asking, how will that contribute to inflation on the national level? The $220 billion budget in New York. We'll go to you, Steve.
Well, Arthur's the expert on inflation and monetary policy, but I'll simply say this, that, you know, these trillions and trillions of dollars of spending and borrowing, mostly at the federal level, are obviously a major impetus, in my opinion, for this high inflation that we're seeing. And so, you know, we've got to start cutting government spending at the federal level. I'd love to see more state legislators say, don't give us more benefits, don't create new entitlement programs. If you really want to help our states, cut federal government spending. That'll bring prices down. This inflation crisis could really lead to, you know, a crash landing. I hope it doesn't, but I just do think that the match that lit this forest fire was the trillions of dollars of spending. We spent $4 to $5 trillion on COVID that we didn't have. I'm not so sure it did much good. And I'll just make one other point related to this. We've done a lot of analysis looking at the effect of all these government benefits to people who are not working. And the big increase in the unemployment benefits had an extremely negative effect in terms of getting people back into the workforce. Now, a lot of those extra benefits have gone away, but we've got to get back to work for welfare reforms in every state. So if you're not doing that in your state, welfare is meant to be, you know, a hand up to help you get your feet back on the ground and get back in the workforce, not to be, we've had people not working now for 2 years since COVID hit. We've got to get people back working, and we shouldn't incentivize them not to work. I don't know if you have any ideas on that, Arthur.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more on that, Steve. I think this is where you really have to give McCrory some credit. I mean, this is a tough thing that he did. If you'll remember what he did back in the day, was he cut the unemployment benefits, I think, from $550 a week to $350 a week. And he reduced the eligibility from 26 weeks, I think, to 12 weeks or something like that. These are very unpopular moves when it happens. But within a year, if you'll remember, his unemployment fund was running a huge surplus. He cut the highest tax rates down to where they were competitive. Jobs came flowing back into North Carolina. You know, this is where states can really make a difference. You know, inflation, and I'm going to quote Milton Friedman on this, is inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. And the states can have a huge amount of impact on too few goods by really encouraging output, employment, and production, by maintaining very low payments for being unemployed and making it literally for what it's supposed to be, a temporary bridge to another job, and not a permanent situation where they don't work. And the other part on the federal level, your spending is completely true, but the Fed has also been totally incompetent in running Fed policy. They have done nothing whatsoever to restrict the growth of the monetary base or any of these other monetary aggregates. They have literally funded the federal deficits year in, year out. and kept it so that there are practically no long-term government bonds owned by the public at large. And
that is one thing, Arthur, to what you just said. You mentioned McCrory, who was the governor of North Carolina, but let's not forget it was Bill Clinton, who was a Democrat in the White House, who actually signed the welfare reforms back in the mid-1990s. And they were tremendously successful. We cut welfare caseloads across the country in half, and those people went into the workforce and started to climb the economic ladder. I think this is, Jonathan, a critically important issue for state legislators. How do you get people back into the workforce? We have 10 million job openings in America today, and we have a record low, virtually a record low labor force participation rate. I think it would be an awesome thing if the state legislators, members of ALEC, really found some programs making sure that we're not incentivizing people not to work, because it's having a very destructive effect.
Well, and one of the pieces on that point is, and I was just speaking with a hotel conference down in Atlanta, where hotel owners and investors are having, this very issue of labor shortage is one of their biggest issues as an industry right now with hospitality. But what about what states are doing, right? The easiest fix to that is stop taxing labor, stop taxing work by getting income tax rates down. So what we're seeing in Iowa and Mississippi and Georgia and all these states, I mean, that is helping at least on that side of the equation. And then obviously getting people back into the workforce other ways by taking away the subsidy to stay at home is clearly important. Governor Gianforte, Governor McMaster, first out of the gate there last year was huge. But let's stop taxing work. Let's tax consumption. Let's not tax people's livelihoods and getting back to the workforce.
Let's reduce all taxes, including consumption too, Jonathan.
Exactly.
So, Jonathan, one follow-up for you. We see a big result of these policies, and we've touched on it a little bit, but it's that taxpayers vote with their feet. And this was really apparent during the pandemic. We saw recent Census Bureau data. Texas, for example, had 600,000 new residents between June of 2020 and June of 2021. But what impact does that have, and do these policies have over time? What have we seen in terms of taxpayers voting with their feet?
Oh, it's a huge phenomenon, and it's one of the key elements of why it's so important to get things right. And Americans, they get it right too. They know exactly what's going on, and that Americans don't vote with their feet and go to states with high taxes and big governments. It doesn't work that way. You go down the line of the states that are growing, the states that are cutting taxes, the states that are doing the right thing. There's this virtuous cycle of attracting businesses, attracting individuals. We know people, the number one reason on census surveys that people go from one state to another is not for better weather. It's not that people are leaving California because the weather's so bad there. Arthur, you didn't leave California because you hated San Diego and you hated the beaches, right? It's the policies that are messed up. And so it's such a key factor in the years of our report. The new census data now coming out of the pandemic, we've seen an uptick in this net domestic migration, where in just 1 year's time, you mentioned the big Texas number, Florida up 200,000 plus. A lot of that is because of what Ron DeSantis and the great work that he did in keeping Florida's economy open, people's livelihoods together during the pandemic, keeping taxes low, doing without a personal income tax and not taxing work and getting people back into the workforce. You add that with Arizona and North Carolina, some of the great examples of in-migration states. Folks, other states that are cutting taxes and keeping taxes low and having an overall solid pro-business outlook. And you can't deny that. I mean, I know, Steve, you debate Paul Krugman on this, and he always tries to say it's everything but people moving for policy reasons and economic opportunity, but it's pretty clear that's what it is.
Hey, can I ask you a question, Jonathan?
Absolutely.
You and the other two there. How is it possible that of the four of us, I'm the only one living in a zero tax state? If you guys profess all this stuff, I mean, is there not a little hypocrisy in all of you? Steve, all of you, Lee, come on.
Yeah, I'm embarrassed. I live in Maryland now. Yeah, we're one of the highest tax states in the country, but we're working on it.
Well, I've got a rough space here in Tennessee for all of you guys. Come on over.
We'll be there. We'll be there.
But by the way, let me just, this tax stuff really does matter. I mean, when we moved from Virginia to Maryland, it was because Virginia had been raising taxes so much that the differential, between Virginia and Maryland had actually been reduced. And so there wasn't actually much more expensive to move across the river into Maryland because Virginia was year after year after year. And by the way, Arthur, these were a lot of Republican governors who were raising taxes. So, this stuff really does, we made a calculation as a family, as millions others do. If we live here versus living there, what's this going to do to our property taxes? What's this going to do to our income taxes? All of these things I think really matter, especially for middle-class families.
By the way, historically, Steve, many of the adoptions of the income tax since 1960 have been by Republican governors. Ogilvy, right. You get that, Connecticut, all of these states have Republicans going in there, and it's just shocking. The nice thing about the politics, Steve, and I think because of you to a large extent, and Jonathan, what's happened is that the politics has turned to where now a lot of Republicans are pro-growth now on tax cutting. That was not true historically.
And that's a great point. And one other thing I wanted to add to that, because you look back at the history of it, and I'd love to get your take on it, Arthur, as well, but on the states that enacted income taxes, those debates were a lot around, how do you buy down property taxes? So instead of doing what California, you did with Prop 13, instead of what we do with the truth in taxation that Tennessee has on the books and Utah has on the books, and states that are trying to add more political accountability to rising assessments and what's happening with property tax bills, which are a clear problem for taxpayers, but they're driven by the local levels of government with their taxing and spending jurisdiction authority in many cases. How did that play into it? And did they just get it wrong, these states that adopted income taxes, and they swapped out the wrong tax?
Well, it's not even swapping out, Jonathan. I mean, as you know, the work we did on Missouri, which is in rich states, poor states as well, the sales tax problem in Missouri. We have property taxes problem here. Now it's minor in Tennessee, but in California, it was the biggest deal before Prop 13. But all of these add together to create a melange of really very anti-growth. There are very few states that are really universally across the board pro-growth. I mean, the one state I'm really very worried about going forward is Wyoming, because their severance taxes have been so large that I think Wyoming would be, in a total tax sense, one of the highest tax states in the nation, but not including severance taxes. I think it's almost the lowest tax state in the nation. Alaska is the highest tax state in the nation with severance taxes. Without them, I think Alaska is the lowest tax state in the nation. And, that's really very damaging because those severance taxes won't last forever. And it's a real problem. And I jokingly told people in Wyoming, we have the Arnold Schwarzenegger twins model. If you remember his movie Twins, Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger, the two, and the twins model, the Danny DeVito is West Virginia. The Arnold Schwarzenegger is Wyoming. But soon, I think Arnold Schwarzenegger is going to be devolving into Danny DeVito if they don't do something really soon preparing for the future. I need to have some fun with this too. I've got to leave, guys. Jonathan, you and Steve and Lee, you guys are wonderful. I love you guys dearly. You've done such a great job in all of this stuff. And I think in our next issue, Jonathan, we have the Unindicted Co-Conspirators chapter, which is the state and local taxes during the Great Depression. It's just shocking how bad states were in that period. But thank you very much, guys. I'm going to go. See you later.
Thanks, Bye. Arthur.
Bye.
Well, thanks for joining us, Dr. Laffer. And Steve, any closing comments from your end before we wrap up today's webinar?
No, thank you very much to ALEC and Lisa and Jonathan. Another great job. I'm just waiting for somebody, please knock Utah off of its perch there as number one. I mean, whether it's Indiana or North Carolina or Arizona, because I mean, we're just getting tired of it, year after year, the Utes having the number one position. It's about time. They're like the UCLA basketball team in the 1960s.
I think they quite enjoy it, Steve, and I think they're looking behind their shoulders to see what's going on and how they can stay ahead. So, I mean, that's the ticket to their success. I mean, they've done so many great things in Utah that, whether it's pension reform, moving to more of the 401k model, which everybody probably needs to, take a look at, these huge unfunded liabilities in state pension systems. All they are future tax increases that as businesses look to go from one state to another, they look at the balance sheet and they say, you've got $1 trillion of unfunded liabilities, California, with CalPERS and CalSTRS. So not only are current tax rates bad, expectations of the future, right? I mean, that's what it's all about. And so Utah has really helped get ahead of that. When they truth in taxation, we talked about property taxes a second ago. That's where the ALEC model legislation comes from. Utah's had it on the books since 1985. That really gets to the heart of these assessment-driven property tax bills that are going out all over the country right now. It's probably, as legislators, is something you're hearing about first and foremost from your constituents. You know, ALEC has a great piece of model that's based on Utah's model, truth in taxation. If you're interested, we'll put it in the chat box here, and we've written a ton on that. But so many great things going on in Utah. Congrats to our friends out there for 15 years at #1. And I think Lee maybe mentioned it on the outset, but you know, this will go live. This is a preview call, a sneak peek for all of you as our ALEC members and friends today. We'll be recording this and sending it out to some of your colleagues that maybe weren't able to join us. But on Monday, on tax day, the IRS gave us an extra 3 days of grace period this year. And that will be when this report goes live, first thing Monday, April 18th. And so if you're interested in writing about this, or you're looking forward to putting together a town hall presentation for your constituents on tax day, and you'd like an embargoed copy of more than just the top and bottom and some of the stories that we've talked about here today, please email us. You can email me, jwilliams@alec.org, or any member of our ALEC team, and we'll make sure we get that to you.
All right, thank you.
Well, thanks, Jonathan. And just to close out our call today, I think obviously that's a great reminder to file your taxes if you haven't already in time for Monday. But our viewers can also go to richstatespoorstates.org. It will be updated on Monday with the latest rankings. It's a great interactive tool to see where your state ranks in each of the 15 equally weighted economic policy variables. There's a great adjust policies tool. You can see how, let's say, an elimination of the income tax might affect your ranking, or any of the other variables. You can tweak and toggle those, see how it would affect your ranking. But again, just want to say thank you to all of our authors, Jonathan Williams, Stephen Moore, and Dr. Art Laffer, for being with us this morning. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks again. We'll see you soon.